Good morning, everyone. I think it's time to begin this morning's webinar. So I'm Alan Barrett, Director of the ESRI, and it's a great pleasure to welcome everybody this morning to the launch of new report, Housing, Health and Happiness. So over the next hour, we're going to be discussing the details of this report. Delighted to say we've been joined by a number of people in addition to the authors who will provide some commentary on the report, and I'll introduce the folks as we go along. As ever, with these sort of events, we'll give you the opportunity to submit some questions. So as the presentations and the discussion is proceeding, feel free to enter questions into the Q&A function, and towards the end of our hour, hopefully we'll have a bit of time to put those questions to the authors, and indeed some of the other contributors will be very welcome to join in that discussion as well. So this work has been done in collaboration with our colleagues in the Housing Agency, and I'm delighted to say that Shane Burke, who's head of research with the Housing Agency, is joining us this morning to kick things off. After that, the authors will go through the report in some detail, and then we'll have colleagues from Threshold and St Vincent de Paul who will contribute to the discussion as well. So with that, Shane, can I invite you to turn on the mic and the camera, and we'll look forward to hearing your remarks.
Thanks very much, Alan, and thanks to the ESRI as well for the invitation to speak about this really important report. So you may know that the research was supported under the Housing Agency's Research Support Programme. The purpose of that research support programme is to fund research which looks at topical issues and can have an impact, I suppose, on policy and practice. So this particular research, I think, really chimes with the Housing Agency's goals to develop and support sustainable communities. I'd like to congratulate the authors of the report. I think it's very important work, and it's great also to see how housing impacts on more psychological dimensions of family and children's lives. It chimes a little bit with some research that we've published ourselves through a national survey. And that survey found that while most people were very satisfied with their homes and neighbourhoods, there of course were some people who weren't and did face challenges. And I think it's important to look into that. And it's an excellent resource, of course, to Growing Up in Ireland data set. Just a little bit about the research support programme then. As I said, well, there's a call out open at the moment until the 30th of August. So we're looking for proposals presently on sustainable communities, looking at the social, economic and environmental dimensions of that. So please have a look at our website under funding opportunities. We've funded to date 21 projects up to a value of about €30,000. So please do have a look and get in touch. And other than that, I'll hand you back to Alan. So thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Shane. And as I said, feel free to stay with us on the panel, and you might want to contribute to some of the discussion later on. Okay, so the next stage in our proceedings is to actually have the details of the report presented. So the report is authored by James Lawrence, Helen Russell and Emer Smith, and nice for me to take the opportunity to congratulate them on another fine piece of work. I understand James is going to take us through the details of the report. So there you are, James, and I guess you'll be sharing some slides as well.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I'd like to also just thank you all for coming today. So I'll be presenting research undertaken by myself and my co-authors, Helen Russell and Emer Smith, and that was funded kindly by the Housing Agency. So I'd just like to thank them for the support of the research as well. I'd also like to thank the members of our steering group who provided invaluable insights throughout this research. So home is really more than just a place of shelter. It really is essential to families' well-being and security. And in recent years, we've obviously seen various indicators that Ireland is in the midst of a housing crisis. So the recent focus of housing policy has understandably been on issues of supply and affordability. However, less attention appears to have been given to the quality of housing and its adequacy for families' needs. adequate housing incorporates not only the kind of physical condition of the housing and the facilities within the home, but also dimensions of security and the suitability of housing for families' needs, alongside the quality of the local environment as well. So international research has shown how experiencing inadequate housing can negatively impact the well-being of adults. But less research has looked at how inadequate housing is linked to children's well-being. And although there is some recent work in Ireland that myself and colleagues did that's shown that children growing up in inadequate housing tend to have poorer developmental outcomes. But alongside this, there's also little research which is focused specifically on the question of why children in inadequate housing have these worse developmental outcomes. That is, what are the pathways really through which inadequate housing harms children's well-being? So the key aim of this project really was to explore how inadequate housing affects families' well-being in Ireland, but also look at what might explain any impact of housing on children's well-being. So there are several ways, really, inadequate housing could impact children's well-being. However, one increasingly promising model is what is known as the family stress model. So this model was originally developed to explain poorer child life outcomes among disadvantaged families. And the idea follows that experiencing economic hardship can lead to a host of acute and chronic stresses in people's lives, such as being able to pay bills or afford necessities. Prolonged exposure to these kinds of stresses, in turn, can then have a negative impact on parents' social and emotional well-being, such as increasing depression, increasing conflict between partners, and also negatively impacting parents' relationships with their children. So these negative parental outcomes from these kinds of stresses, in turn, are then believed to have a negative knock-on effect and harm the well-being of their children. So in the case of housing, it is suggested that inadequate housing can also act as a source of stresses in parents' lives. For example, cramped conditions may make parenting more stressful, or exposure to everyday disorder in local areas can increase anxiety and depression. If this is the case, then these negative outcomes amongst parents from inadequate housing could then spill over and explain why inadequate housing may harm the well-being of children. So in essence, therefore, inadequate housing may indirectly harm children's well-being via its negative impact on the well-being of their parents. So this leads us to the key research questions of the study. First, what kind of families are most at risk of experiencing inadequate housing? Second, how does inadequate housing shape children's well-being? Third, how does inadequate housing shape parents' well-being? And then fourth, in line with this family stress model, can the impact of inadequate housing on parents' well-being explain any of its effects among children? So critically, the study also aimed to examine whether longer periods exposed to inadequate housing conditions are linked to even worse outcomes for families than shorter periods. When it comes to measuring inadequate housing, we take a multidimensional approach. So this includes, on one hand, looking at housing conditions, such as its suitability. For example, is it too small, or does it have poor conditions, such as damp or leaks? It also looks at whether families are able to keep the household warm, their access to outdoor spaces, or the types of tenancies they're in. However, the approach also takes in conditions of the wider community as well, such as how much disorder there is in the neighborhood, or how much trust and social support people have in within their neighbors, as well as families' access to local amenities. We also look at experiences of residential mobility in this idea of inadequate housing as well. Now, when it comes to the well-being of families, the report looks at a range of parental well-being outcomes through which inadequate housing might feasibly impact their children's well-being. So this includes mental well-being, such as depression, but it also includes a range of social and relational indicators, such as the relationship quality between partners, how stressful they find parenting, their parenting style, such as whether it's warm or hostile, and also how much conflict or closeness they experience with their child. We also look at physical health in the report, but we won't explore this in the presentation today. When it comes to children, in this report, we focus specifically on children's social and emotional well-being. To capture this, we use the Strengths and Difficulties Total Score, which really kind of captures peer relationship problems, behavioral problems, and emotional symptoms like anxiety. So to investigate the key aims of the study, we draw on data from the 2008 cohort of the Growing Up in Ireland study. So this gathered information about children born in 2008, as well as on their primary and secondary caregivers. So in particular, we used data on children when they were 9 months old, when they were 3, age 5, and age 9, which was in 2017 to 18. In this presentation, we focus specifically on the link between mothers' well-being and that of their children. And in the report, we also look at the father-child link where present, but we find the effects are actually much stronger in the mother-child link. So just a couple of key points to keep in mind. Firstly, we look at the relationship between mother's well-being and children's well-being when the children were age 9. Secondly, we look at how the length of time families experienced inadequate housing between the ages of 3 and age 9 are linked with families' well-being at age 9. And thirdly, we're also kind of controlling for family well-being at age 3 as well in the past. There's a couple of limitations to the data to keep in mind. Firstly, given the sample size of the Growing Up in Ireland study, there is only a small number of the members of the traveller community present in the data, or families in direct provision as well. And so because these numbers are too small, it's very difficult to analyse these groups separately. Secondly, the data do not contain most families directly experiencing homelessness. And thirdly, those families with more unstable housing trajectories over time are probably more likely to have dropped out of the data. So taken together, families experiencing some of the most acute forms of inadequate housing may actually be absent from the data. Okay, so we turn now to the first aim of looking at which families are most at risk of experiencing longer periods in inadequate housing. So we'll focus just on a few of the most important predictors and just some of the main dimensions of inadequate housing here, but please do see the report for the full results. So as might be expected, lower household income is one of the strongest predictors of inadequate housing. Lower income families spend more time in housing they consider too small, that is not child friendly, and that has poor conditions such as damp or leaks. They also struggle to keep the household warm and tend to live in areas with higher disorder and less trust and connectivity with neighbours. That is essentially lower kind of levels of social cohesion. However, interestingly, even after accounting for families' incomes, several other indicators of disadvantage are strongly linked to inadequate housing. So lone parent households struggle to keep the household warm. They move more frequently and live in neighbourhoods with more disorder and less cohesion. Households with one or both parents out of work also tend to live in housing that is less suitable for their needs. They struggle to heat their home and also tend to move more frequently as well. A family's disability status also matters a lot. Where one or both parents have disabilities, they also spend longer living in unsuitable housing, especially homes that are too small. They struggle to heat the household, move more frequently, and tend to live in poorer quality neighbourhoods. Families with children with a disability as well also tend to experience similar dimensions of inadequate housing. We also find that some families where one or both parents are non-Irish nationals are also more likely to experience inadequate housing compared to Irish national parents. So in particular, families with fathers and or mothers who are of an Asian or African national background appear more at risk of living in inadequate housing. The results also show us that families living in rented accommodation or in the homes of their child's grandparents experience more inadequate housing than those in owned homes. In particular, what's quite striking is families in social housing are more likely to live in homes that are considered too small, that are not child friendly, and that have poor conditions such as damp and leaks. They also struggle more to heat the household, they move more frequently, and tend to live in poorer quality neighborhoods too. Interestingly, we also see that families who have experienced adverse life events are more likely to be in adequate housing as well. So in particular, the results showed that families where there is a mental disorder in the immediate family, they spend longer in unsuitable homes, in homes they struggle to heat, they live in more disorderly areas and move more frequently. Addiction issues in the immediate family, such as drug taking or alcoholism, are also linked to families spending longer in things like unsuitable accommodation. And where families have had some contact with the criminal justice system, they also tend to spend somewhat more time in homes they struggle to heat or in disorderly neighborhoods as well. It's important to note, though, just at this stage, but as we'll talk about later, the relationships between things like mental health or addiction and inadequate housing likely kind of go in both directions. So inadequate housing could harm mental health, but while poorer mental health could affect families' chances of being in inadequate housing as well. Okay, so we next turn to look at how the amount of time a family spends in inadequate housing is linked to the well-being of mothers and also the well-being of their children. But we'll also look at how any impact of housing on mothers' well-being may in turn kind of shape the well-being, excuse me, of their children. So again, in the report itself, we go into this into a lot more detail, but for now, we'll just kind of focus on a smaller selection of indicators to give you a sense of the key relationships. So here on this slide, we begin by looking at how children's experiences of inadequate housing between the ages of 3 and 9 are linked with their social and emotional well-being at age 9 after controlling for their well-being at age 3. And what this figure shows is the links between inadequate housing and children's well-being. So what we can see here, these are the links, these are the kind of indicators of inadequate housing, and this is children's well-being. And what we can see is that children who spend more time growing up in unsuitable homes that were too small or that had poor conditions, they tend to have lower levels of well-being than their peers. Similarly, children who spent longer in homes that families struggle to keep warm also tend to have lower well-being at age 9. And we also find that the quality of children's communities really matters a lot as well. So those who spend longer growing up in disorderly neighborhoods or areas with lower social cohesion also tend to have poorer social and emotional well-being. Okay, so we've seen that experiencing inadequate housing is linked with child well-being. The next question then is why? So as outlined in the family stress model previously, one pathway through which inadequate housing could be linked to children's well-being is through its impact on parents' well-being. So in this case, mothers' well-being. So what this figure shows is the results of modeling, which tests whether inadequate housing has a significant negative relationship with children's well-being via its relationship with different dimensions of a mother's well-being. So firstly, it shows us that mothers who spend longer in homes that are too small tend to find parenting more stressful. That's this line here. So secondly, it shows us that parents who find parenting more stressful, this is in turn linked with poorer child well-being as well. So taken together, really, what we're seeing is that a key reason why cramped housing conditions are negatively linked with children's well-being is because mothers in cramped conditions tend to find parenting more stressful. So we see this indirect negative effect on child well-being through stressful parenting. So similarly, we also see that living in homes with poor conditions, such as damp or leaks, is linked to higher depression amongst mothers, which is in turn then linked to worse well-being amongst children. So therefore, again, what we're seeing is that a key reason poor housing conditions are linked with lower child well-being is because mothers experiencing such conditions have higher depression, and this negatively impacts children's well-being. So in this next slide, we look at the pathways really through which struggling to heat the household is linked to children's well-being. And what we can see here is that mothers who spend longer living in homes that they struggle to heat tend to have higher depression. They find parenting more stressful. They have a more hostile parenting style and report less closeness and more conflict with their child. And now, interestingly, all of these negative maternal well-being outcomes are in turn negatively linked with children's well-being. So what we see is that growing up in homes that families struggle to keep warm really impacts children's well-being through a range of negative pathways where it's affected mothers' well-being as well. just to note, I guess, here is that these relationships already account for things like household income, for education, for other indicators of families' economic situation as well. So it really appears to be something linked, at least in part, to their housing situation in particular that matters. So in this slide, we look at the pathways through which communities are linked with children's well-being, and it's essentially the same kind of picture. So firstly, neighborhood disorder appears to be linked with poorer child well-being, as we saw, in part because mothers who spend longer living in more disorderly neighborhoods tend to have higher depression, they tend to find parenting more stressful, they tend to have a more hostile parenting style, and report less closeness and more conflict with their child. And all of these negative maternal well-being outcomes are, again, linked with lower child well-being as well. Meanwhile, when it comes to lower neighborhood cohesion, this appears to be linked to poorer child well-being, in part because mothers who spend longer in low cohesion neighborhoods find parenting more stressful and report less closeness with their child, both of which, again, are linked to poorer child well-being. Okay, so we'll wrap up now with just some concluding remarks and drawing on the report as a whole. So the results show us that some families are much more at risk of experiencing longer periods in inadequate housing than others. So families with lower household income are at particular risk. However, even after counting for income, we see that long-term access to resources also appears to play a key role. So with those excluded from the labor market, such as lone parent families and parents with a disability in the household, also experience poorer quality housing. The results also show us that inadequate housing in turn is strongly linked to a range of poorer well-being outcomes among families. Children who spend longer growing up in inadequate housing, they have lower social and emotional well-being. Meanwhile, mothers who spend longer in inadequate housing report higher rates of depression, more conflict and less closeness with their children, finding parenting more difficult, having more hostile and less warm parenting styles, and also poorer quality relationships with their partner. Importantly, a kind of key thing to take away from this is also that the longer families spend in inadequate housing, the worse their well-being outcomes appear. But the results also show that considering the conditions of families' neighborhoods alongside their homes is critical for understanding well-being. In fact, we actually find that accounting for things like neighborhood disorder reduces some of the link between other dimensions of inadequate homes and well-being outcomes. We also find evidence that one of the key potential reasons why inadequate housing is linked to poorer child well-being appears to be because because of its effect on well-being among mothers. So in other words, mothers experiencing inadequate housing tend to have these worse mental and social and relational well-being outcomes. And this in turn looks like it's linked to poorer child well-being. So again, it kind of provides this evidence in support of this family stress model. So although we do go some way towards accounting for the causality of these relationships, it is important to keep in mind processes might be working in the other direction as well. So for example, inadequate housing could impact children's well-being directly, which in turn could then spill over to negatively impact the well-being of parents. In addition, as mentioned, lower familial well-being might push families into inadequate housing as well. In reality, though, it's likely that a lot of these relationships are kind of bi-directional, right? So where inadequate housing might both harm well-being, but then poorer well-being might also lead families into inadequate housing as well. And probably at its worst, this could set up a kind of negative feedback loop where some families, because of these processes, end up being trapped in more inadequate housing homes. So we'll just finish now by highlighting a few of the key policy implications from the research. One key takeaway is that alongside the much needed, obviously, focus of housing policy on issues of supply, we see that issues of housing quality are really critical to consider. So the quality and adequacy of any new housing developments for families' needs should therefore form a key element of future plans and designs of new builds. Another key finding to emerge is the importance of being able to adequately heat the household for families' well-being. So we see that it's linked to a lot of negative well-being outcomes for both the parents and children. And we also see that damp conditions, which is clearly linked with these kinds of things, have been shown to harm families' physical health as well. So we suggest that targeted support to address fuel poverty and prioritizing issues of heating efficiency will have long-term benefits for families, especially in times of high energy prices. The research also points to efforts to improve the physical and social infrastructure of neighborhoods as well, especially in areas with social housing. So in the short term, further support for integrated service provision through child and family support networks, which are often embedded in local areas, could really improve outcomes in more disadvantaged areas. Lone parents are another structurally vulnerable group that experience some of the most inadequate housing outcomes that we found. A second tier targeted child benefit payment to lower income families would be in a highly effective way of lifting children and their families out of poverty and potentially improving their housing outcomes as well. But I think overall, one of the kind of key takeaways from this is that given problems experienced in early years among children can leave a lasting scar on children's development and life outcomes into adulthood, then interventions which target the kind of causes of these early on, including inadequate housing for families, will definitely pay dividends later in life. Thank you very much for listening.
Great. Thanks so much, James. Fascinating study all in all. Very, very important findings. So again, sincere thanks to you and to Helen and to Emer. Okay, so we're going to get a bit of reaction to the report. So I'm first going to call on Anne-Marie O'Reilly from Threshold, who will give us her reaction. So Anne-Marie, over to you.
Thanks a million, Alan. So yeah, first of all, I just want to say well done to everyone who's involved in producing this valuable and quality piece of research. And I certainly found myself nodding along in agreement as I read through it. I think any of us who've worked in social care or worked marginalised and vulnerable people in their homes can attest to all that is set out in the report. But having this evidence base, having this research is essential, and it will be key in advocating and lobbying for change in how we deliver housing and public services. So I've always worked in the area of homelessness and housing, so my perspective may be a tad skewed, but I see access to adequate housing as the issue of prime importance in achieving a fair and equitable society in which we can all prosper. And so when we look at the characteristics of adequate housing as defined in the International Covenant of Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, they all seem so reasonable and basic. And so it's that definition of adequate housing that's used in the report. So for those who aren't familiar with it, the characteristics are legal security of tenure, availability of services, affordable housing, habitable housing. You know, that seems quite basic. Accessible housing, location, and location does refer to that, you know, what's happening in the community around you. So having amenities, having not having that disorder, which James referred to, and then culturally adequate housing. So these types of characteristics should be central to all policy making when it comes to housing. These should be the starting point of any housing development, not the nice to haves or the items that can be traded off in exchange for maybe a bit more profit or squeezing a few more units into a development. And so there are many ways in which policy can address the issues identified in the research. For example, mixed tenure housing, which we are starting to see a bit more of. Replicating the community building activities of the approved housing bodies. This may be something for the local authority staff to consider, particularly given a report showed that those in social housing that experience higher disorder in their communities. You know, and the role of the planning authority in ensuring the availability and provision of local amenities and the enabling infrastructure. The design standards for new developments, and there I'm thinking specifically of the build to rent standards back in 2018, where properties that were being delivered as build to rent didn't have to be as big as properties that were for owner occupation. So it really doesn't make any sense to me. And that idea, and that came through in the research, not having the space. Um, and that's important, especially when there's children in the family. Children need space to play. So the space in the home, the space for their toys, the space to run around, and then also the space outside the home where it's safe for them to run and play and spend time with their friends. We also have the minimum standards for the private rental sector, but we need to get them working a bit better, and I'll touch on that in a few minutes. And then engagement with landlords to take up the grants and tax breaks to retrofit rental properties, because the grants and tax breaks are there. So what's really important when we set about delivering housing is ensuring that homes are large enough space to actually live, children to play, with local shops, a GP, schools, the yoga studio, the GA ground, all those things that probably a lot of us take for granted. It doesn't necessarily have to be the yoga or the GAA, but to have access to these within a reasonable distance. And all those wonderful things that are really essential, that are more than just nice to have. And so it's for that reason, it's not simply enough to build thousands of homes with little regard to how people will live and thrive in them. And so this is why when some people talk about supply, it's all about supply. Many people say, yes, but the right supply. And it isn't about wanting the world. It's about wanting the minimum to allow us to thrive as a society. So Threshold, alongside many others, including the Housing Commission, want to see social cost rental housing make up 20 to 25% of all housing stock. And so this would move us towards a unitary model of housing in which a greater share of the population would live in secure tenancies and in the social cost rental sector. And this would put downward pressure on the private market, forcing providers to make better offerings, hopefully forcing that poor quality housing out, and maybe some of the more unscrupulous actors out of the sector. Now, albeit work is needed within the social renter sector also to improve standards and build those communities. But this is where we can look to what the AHBs are doing in terms of building communities. But it's not enough for us to talk about all of this for future supply. We need to think about the current stock of housing, where people are currently living and experiencing stress, ill health, and poor well-being, and where the children in those homes are going to have poor outcomes because of all of this. And so it is difficult to imagine a time when all housing will be adequate. And while housing options will hopefully improve for the majority, it will be those people who are marginalised and vulnerable who will find themselves living in housing that is subpar into the future. So we need to think about mitigating measures, and my area of focus is the private rental sector. So I will stick to that. So based on the findings from the report, the three main areas that need to be addressed in the private rental sector are security, poor energy efficiency, and poor standards. So we can use legislation to provide for tenancies for longer defined periods, which can only be ended by the landlord if the tenant has breached the terms of agreement. And so Threshold has put forward some proposals on this in the past, particularly in relation to connecting it to any favourable tax treatment for landlords. And I know Dr. Michael Byrne in UCD, who I think is attending today, has some fantastic proposals around how we can achieve this that would balance the interest of both landlord and tenant, which when we're working in a market does have to be a consideration. But essentially this would reduce the number of forced moves experienced by private renters, as pointed out in the study, which result in negative outcomes for children. When it comes to the energy efficiency, to allow families to be better able to heat the homes, there are grants and tax breaks there for landlords to carry out the retrofits, but unfortunately there hasn't been a huge take up. And as identified in the report, the split incentive is a barrier to this. So the landlord pays the money for it, but doesn't necessarily receive the direct benefit of the improvement. And the tenant then doesn't necessarily have the funds, and even if they did have the funds, if they were to carry out the retrofit, well, they could be kicked out in a year or two, and that's wasted money for them. Now, the SEAI have conducted research into this and identified actions to address it, and these include increasing awareness around the schemes and normalising the uptake through promotional campaigns. There's a bit more detail to that within the SAI report itself, and Threshold have worked with St Vincent de Paul on this area and have set out a document with a range of recommendations on how we can make improvements in the energy efficiency of the private rental sector stock. So then in regards to poor standards, work needs to be done on the local authority inspection system to ensure renters are not living in houses with poor standards in the first instance. So to tackle this, Threshold has proposed that landlords only be permitted to rent out their homes when those homes meet the minimum standards. And again, they are minimum. If they don't set out standards for people to live in palaces or anything like that, hot and cold running water, ventilation, appropriate heating, appliances that work, it be in a good state of structural repair. And where a landlord may not have the resources to carry out the work, Threshold has suggested perhaps the local authority may be able to enter into a repair and lease agreement with that landlord to get the property up to a minimum standard so that somebody can live and thrive in that home. So that's my contribution. And yeah, I look forward to the discussion.
Many thanks for that, Anne-Marie. You raised a whole host of issues, I have to say, that I was just reflecting on as you were speaking. So hopefully we'll have a bit of time to pick up some of those themes. But again, many thanks. So next I want to invite Marcella Stakem from the Society of St Vincent de Paul. So again, Marcella, you're very welcome. Thanks for taking the invitation to speak to us today, and we'll look forward to hearing your reaction.
Thanks so much, Alan, and thank you to James and Helen and Emer for the invitation to speak today, and congratulations on such an excellent report. It is a very detailed, comprehensive piece of work which challenges those of us that do have an advocacy role to continually highlight the issue of housing insecurity from the perspective of child and family health and well-being, which we are really satisfied about in SVP, and we're delighted to be part of the steering committee as a result. There is a lot in it, so I'm not going to highlight everything, but I do want to put emphasis on that it does capture everything we see and experience through home visitation in SVP. I will begin by just giving some of my observations on the report, which are intertwined and they're connected with our own experiences. And then I'll highlight just a couple of the policy implications. Last year, we received over 250,000 calls from callers in SVP from people that were struggling financially and not able to afford the essentials such as food, heat, and light. And 60% of those calls were from lone parent women who are in low paid employment or are reliant on a social welfare payment. And last year we received almost 30,000 calls from people who received who made that call for the first time to SVP. So I think that's really indicative of the challenge that people are facing and the plight that people are facing, particularly with the rising costs of living in the last number of years. So where you live and how you live is shown very clearly in this report for us to have a direct impact on a family's well-being. And we do see that daily reality for people through our home visitation. A report we published in 2019 showed that the consequences of living in energy poverty impacts on children's health, with an increased risk and likelihood that they will develop asthma and that they will be on 2 or more courses of antibiotics in a 12-month period. And that's really been borne out in the research as well, like how serious it is for families. The reliance on the private rented sector to meet social housing need, it does leave families in a state of limbo and constant stress. For us, we see accessibility, quality accommodation and affordability are key issues for families. Increasingly, the issue of tenants living in private rented accommodation paying unaffordable HAP top-ups is really putting significant stress on families and is in often cases the main reason why people are contacting us for help, as well as high energy costs and food costs. The report it highlights interesting findings relating to the effects on maternal health and well-being, and that having a direct negative impact on the child's health and well-being. And we do see that played out when we visit a family. Our members see that toll that poor housing and housing insecurity has on parents' health and well-being. There is that constant state of stress and anxiety by parents as they try to deal with multiple challenges and emotions and feelings as regards their living status. There is that sense of shame that often their home is in poor quality, that they cannot provide the essentials for their children. And there is constant anxiety there around their housing status and will they have a home for their children this time next month or next year. So as well as trying to provide practical support for the family, members also try and ensure that children do have good experiences like their peers or friends may have that they go to school with. So for example, members will often try and give SU passes or cinema tickets or financial help with trips away. And that is just to help and support parents and their children to get away from that grinding exhaustion that poverty and housing insecurity brings with it. I will address some of the policy implications now. I won't go into too much detail. I think Anne-Marie done a great job in highlighting many of those, which we would also advocate and support and endorse in SVP. The policy interventions that are mentioned in the report around housing affordability, quality accommodation, community enhancement and participation are all addressed in the report, which is very positive for us that have an advocacy role. So I suppose as been already outlined, having secure, safe and affordable housing is the cornerstone and is paramount really for families' physical, their social, their emotional health and development. And that's really just the cornerstone and you know, the foundation before we look to any of the other needs. We also agree that early intervention and prevention supports are key to supporting families, but they also, which is also highlighted in the report, they also need to be adequately resourced and promoted so that there is sufficient awareness of them. One of those supports that's mentioned, excuse me, in the report is the homeschool liaison officer, and we would welcome the mention of that in the report because we would find that as a really good intervention in a child's life, but also the whole family's life. And unfortunately, we see that support is not in all schools, and we have recommended that should be the case, that it should be addressed and should be rolled out to all schools. The need for retrofitting and targeted adequate financial assistance to meet energy costs is something that we have called for many years in SVP and will continue to do so, particularly around because of the high rise in energy costs in the last number of years. So there are really good policy implications outlined in the report, but I think I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you for listening, and thanks again for everyone involved, and congratulations to everyone involved in the ESRI for the report. For us, there's so many rich, interesting areas for discussion and policy development, which we are really happy in SVP to see and to utilise in our policy and advocacy efforts. So thank you.
Great, and thanks to you, Marcella, again, very much sort of illuminating the findings in your remarks. So sincere thanks for that, and feel free to stay on the panel where we take some questions. So certainly if I can invite James, Helen and Emer, and again, welcome back, Anne-Marie. So there's a number of questions coming. We're slightly tight on time, so I'll just get straight into them. And again, some of these I'm just going to read out verbatim. So firstly, from our former colleague, Aisling Murray, question, are you using the parent-reported or teacher-reported SDQ at age 9? So, and again, supplementary, if you use the parent report, it would be interesting to see if there are similar patterns when child well-being is evaluated by somebody other than the stressed mother. So it's partly a methodological question, but there is substance in the question as well. So I don't know who'd like to take it.
Sure, I'll get it. That's a great question, Ashlyn. We use the parent measure of SDQ, and I think that's a great idea. It would be really interesting to see whether that bears out in the teacher's evaluation of it as well, I suppose. I think as you mentioned in the question, stressed parents may be more likely to evaluate their relationship with their child more negatively. So that's definitely one for future research.
Just on that as well, though, it's important to remember, and based on other research, that children's behaviour can be quite different in different contexts. So teachers may be less likely to pick up on more internalising difficulties like emotional difficulties, but be more aware of externalising difficulties. But so I think both would give us insights, and it is a good idea for future research, as James would say.
Okay, thanks for that. Next question from Catherine Harford. And actually, I think, Helen, you were asked about this on Morning Ireland this morning. So did you look at the father or other relationships in the household? And again, supplementary to that, do you have any comment on single parent households? So again, any of the three, you feel free to jump in on that.
I can jump in for that one. Yes. So in this, we're focusing on the mothers, because we were really interested in that sort of pathway through maternal stress, and then how that impacted the child. And the previous research has suggested that that link is stronger for the mother's well-being and the child's well-being than fathers. But we did look in earlier analysis on fathers as well. There were similar patterns there. I mean, for the lone parents, we are finding very strong effects across all these, of being in inadequate housing across nearly all the measures that we have. And this is, as James is saying, this is over and above the income effect. So even controlling for low income, and it's partly related to housing tenure. The more likely to be in social housing and private rental housing, and much less likely to be in owner-occupied housing. So it's partly through that link as well. I suppose the other thing where we're looking at in other relationships is in the mother also recording lower quality relationships with the father, with the higher or the poorer the quality of the housing is. There's that link there as well.
And actually, can I ask, and actually this is one that Anne-Marie and Marcella could comment on, the concept of other relationships. Presumably this impacts on children's ability to have friendship networks. And I can't remember if it was Marcella or Anne-Marie, but I think one of you touched on this idea. I think you even used I don't know if the word shame or embarrassment came up, but that if you live in sort of, particularly poor conditions, maybe you're less likely to have friends around and stuff like that, or your parents may not encourage you. And is there evidence that friendship relationships suffer for kids as well? So again, Marcella, Anne-Marie, or Shane can take that, or indeed any of the authors.
Yeah, we do see that through our home visitation, most definitely. For children, they do pick up on the dynamics and what is happening within the home. So they do understand, and they do see that there is levels of poverty, and there's levels of stress and worry for their parents that they see, and has an impact on them. And yes, we would often hear from children say, like, yeah, we wouldn't bring people to our home. We just don't. We don't want to bring our friends to our home. There's no place to play. It's just not a nice place, to bring anybody, because we're just existing. We see that more and more, and particularly, I know the research doesn't pick it up around homelessness, particularly for children that are experiencing homelessness, that are living in insecure homes. That's really relevant and really illuminating for us, that is the reality for many children, that they just don't have that home, that home life that they can feel secure and safe in.
Sure. No, and actually, I mean, I'm glad you just mentioned homelessness. There is another comment. in the Q&A, where somebody is sort of essentially making that point that this report looks at poor housing conditions, but presumably the sort of effects you're looking at are then magnified if you look into a situation of homelessness. So I can imagine that is the case. I see Mike Allen is on the call, and I just want to read out something from Mike. So the link between poverty and poor housing has a long history. The primary policy response to this has been the provision of social housing, and this is a key point from Mike here. So it's very worrying to see the link between social housing and poor quality housing. The recently published Commission on Housing addresses this link, highlighting that the differential rent model leaves housing authorities with insufficient income to maintain properties. Again, that is troubling. The ESRI report shows how important it is for wider society for the recommendations to be implemented quickly. So again, that's more a comment than a question, but I think some important issues are raised there. Question from Jerry Hone: do the authors see this research being used by local authorities in town planning? So again, I don't know, Helen, Emer, or James, if you feel qualified to comment on planning issues. Helen?
I mean, I think some of the findings around communities and services are really important for planning. So the effects of, and Anne-Marie and Marcella mentioned it as well, access to services in the local community is really important. And one of the things that we look at is having a safe place outside for children to play, feeling that they're safe in the area. And I think that's a lot of that is down to design as well of our communities, whether the roads are, whether the traffic is really busy in the area, and there's lots of the built environment is really important in terms of safety, as well as the community piece as well.
Okay, next question. I'll read out. I'm not sure if I entirely. So, could the findings of this report be tied into study regarding adverse child experiences and poorer outcomes for children based on higher ACE, which I guess is adverse child experience score, or was the study referenced during the writing of the report? I don't know. Does that question? I'm not sure I fully understand the question. I'm not sure. Okay, I'm not. We
did look at those adverse childhood experience in the context of just looking at these as additional predictors of big and poor housing. So we did find that where families had been in contact with the criminal justice system, or whether there was mental health problems in the household, that they were again predictors of inadequate housing. Again, it's a bit difficult to unpick the causality there. I'm not sure I'm quite answering the question though, but we did look at it in that context, and they certainly influence the housing inadequacy, which in turn has an effect on the children. So there could be direct and indirect effects.
Okay, so from Hayley Curran, begins by saying a great report and analysis with an exclamation mark. Always good to see. And here's the important question though. Just wondering if there is a differentiation between local authority and approved housing body social housing in this research. So what Hayley is driving at here is that there are different sort of policies, and she gives an example. There is an allocated budget for local authority housing retrofitting upgrades, but the AHBs apply for the SEAI grant similar to a private household. Okay, so I guess there are, we talk about social housing, but there are these sort of two components of it. So what was that addressed in the report? And again, if Marcella, Anne-Marie or Shane sort of wants to comment on that, is that an important sort of differentiator?
Just to say, Alan, in growing up in Ireland, we can't differentiate those, and we similarly can't distinguish those on the housing assistance payment, but who are in the private rented sector. So I think there's capacity to look at that greater detail. There's a new birth cohort starting for growing up in Ireland later in the year, so I think hopefully that will reflect the kind of more complex configuration and the blurring of boundaries between social and private rented.
Interesting. Yeah. No, again, thanks for that, Emer. Owen Anglum begins with apologies. This is a stupid question. So it's your we should say that no such thing as a stupid question, but was attachment theory incorporated into this research? So I have to confess, I don't know what attachment theory is, but maybe the sociologists on the call are more familiar.
Some of that would be captured in the parenting style, but attachment theory focuses more, to the best of my knowledge at least, on the early formation of relationships and attachment in infancy. So we didn't actually trace it all the way back to 9 months, but that should be captured really through ongoing parenting and the quality of relationships.
Mm-hmm. No, we should have. Sadly, we're going to have to draw things to a close. But I think one of the fascinating things to look at, again, as the growing up in Ireland children get older and move into adulthood, is looking at these relationships between housing quality. And I think, again, a number of the contributors has made this, reference to this already, that your accumulated difficulties and disadvantage or whatever like that really, really matter as you move into adulthood. But it's fortunately, the Growing Up in Ireland survey gives us the opportunity to look at that. But I have to say, this is yet again one of these sort of reports which is very troubling. I mean, I think the findings really point to some severe difficulties for so many people, and some heartbreaking stories in all truth as well. And I think, again, Marcella and Anne-Marie brought this out very, very clearly. So look, we're just up against the noon deadline, so I'm going to draw things to a close. So I just want to thank everybody who logged on today. Always want to thank the authors for a fine study, and James for a fantastic presentation. Again, Marcella and Anne-Marie, thanks so much for your contributions. Shane, thanks for your contribution today, but of course, more broadly, for the support of the Housing Agency in undertaking this work. So with that, I guess we'll log off, but I'm sure we'll see you all before too long. Bye bye.